When Daniel and Rebecca Lawson bought their newly constructed home in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, they believed they were stepping into a clean beginning. Fresh paint, untouched hardwood floors, a backyard that still smelled of new sod. It was the kind of house built for stability, for routines, dinner parties, and eventually children. The listing had emphasized something unusual: completed but previously owned. The builder had sold it to a man who relocated almost immediately. According to the realtor, he barely lived there. That struck Rebecca as odd, but not alarming. The first few days were filled with unpacking, assembling furniture, and discovering the subtle quirks of the property. On the fourth evening, Daniel decided to inspect the basement more thoroughly. He wanted to map out where he'd set up a home gym. The basement was unfinished but clean: concrete floors, exposed beams, a furnace humming softly. It smelled faintly of drywall and insulation. Nothing felt out of place. Until Daniel noticed a seam in the far wall. It was subtle. A faint vertical line in the concrete near the back corner, partially hidden behind stacked leftover tiles. He brushed the tiles aside. There was a door. Not a storage panel, not access to plumbing. A full-sized, solid-core door painted the same dull gray as the surrounding concrete, blending almost perfectly into the wall. Rebecca came downstairs when she heard the scraping. "Was that always there?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "It's not on the blueprint." He pulled up the digital floor plan on his phone, the exact one they reviewed before closing. The basement layout showed open space, utility sections, and support beams. No additional room, no door. Rebecca stepped closer. The handle was industrial steel, a heavy deadbolt locked from the outside. Cold air drifted from the crack beneath it. "That's not normal," she whispered. Daniel pressed his palm against the surface. The door felt colder than the surrounding concrete, almost as if the temperature behind it was different. "Probably storage," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Then why hide it?" Silence filled the basement, interrupted only by the furnace kicking on. Daniel hesitated, then slid the bolt open. The metal scraped loudly, echoing across the concrete. He turned the handle. The door resisted at first, as if something inside pushed back. Then it gave way with a low suction sound. A wave of cold air spilled out. Not dusty, not stale. Cold. Daniel switched on his phone flashlight and stepped inside. The beam revealed rough concrete walls, forming a small square room, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. No windows, no vents, no wiring, just raw, sealed space. And in the center, a metal chair bolted directly to the floor. Rebecca stopped at the doorway. Why would anyone anchor a chair like that? Daniel crouched to inspect it. Thick steel bolts secured each leg into the slab. The armrests showed deep scratch marks carved into the metal. Near the back wall, something small caught Rebecca's eye. She moved closer and felt her chest tighten. A child-sized sneaker. Pink and gray, worn at the edges, laces still tied. Beside it sat a wooden crate. Inside the crate, a single VHS tape. No label, no date. Daniel picked it up slowly. The plastic felt warm. Rebecca swallowed. "We're not watching that down here." Daniel's eyes drifted toward the far corner of the room. Something about the angle of the walls unsettled him. The space felt occupied, as if someone had once stood there for long periods of time. He stepped back into the basement. They carried the tape upstairs. Neither of them spoke as Daniel found the old VCR he'd kept in storage for nostalgia. When he inserted the cassette and pressed play, static filled the television screen. Then the image stabilized. The previous owner sat in that exact metal chair, facing the camera, talking to himself. But the camera angle showed something else in the corner behind him, a shadow, standing perfectly still. And Daniel felt his stomach drop, because that shadow was not part of the man's reflection. The tape reveals what the previous owner was confessing and why someone else was already inside that room with him. The television screen flickered for several seconds before the image steadied into something disturbingly clear. The previous owner sat upright in the same bolted metal chair Daniel had just inspected in the basement. The concrete walls behind him were unmistakable. The lighting was harsh, casting sharp shadows across his face, which looked thinner than it should have been, as though he hadn't slept in days. He stared directly into the camera, breathing slowly, almost rehearsing his words before speaking. "If anyone finds this," he began, his voice uneven but deliberate, "you need to understand that I didn't build this room. I only found it." Rebecca felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the couch. On screen, the man rubbed his temples and glanced briefly toward the right side of the frame, toward the darker corner of the room. The camera angle made that section partially visible, but not entirely. There was a pocket of shadow there that didn't quite behave like normal darkness. It looked denser, defined. "I thought it was storage too," the man continued. "I thought maybe the contractors made a mistake. But the air there, it changes at night." Daniel leaned forward slightly. The audio picked up a faint sound in the background. It was subtle, a soft scraping noise, almost like fabric brushing concrete. The man stopped speaking. His eyes shifted again toward the corner. "You don't have to stand there," he whispered suddenly, his tone no longer directed at the camera. Rebecca's breath caught. He swallowed hard and faced forward again. "I don't like it when I ignore it. That's what I've learned." The scraping grew louder for a brief moment before stopping altogether. Daniel muted the volume instinctively, as if reducing the sound might lessen whatever tension had crept into the living room. They stared at the frozen image on screen, the previous owner, mid-breath, eyes wide, head slightly turned. Rebecca reached for the remote and unmuted it. On screen, the man continued speaking, but now his voice had lowered into something almost apologetic. "I tried to seal it off. I bolted the door. I thought if I stopped going inside, it would stop watching." Rebecca turned toward Daniel slowly. "Watching." As if responding to that word, the man in the video tilted his head toward the corner again. And that's when Daniel noticed the detail he had missed the first time. The shadow in the corner had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention at first glance, but its outline was slightly closer to the chair now, more defined against the concrete wall. The man seemed aware of it too. "I won't bring anyone else down here," he said quietly. "I promise." There was a long pause. Then the camera jolted slightly, as if something had brushed against the tripod. The man's expression changed completely. Fear replaced control. And before the footage cut to static, he whispered one final sentence. "It followed me home." The screen went black. The room around Daniel and Rebecca felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened. Rebecca finally broke the silence. "He said he found the room. That means someone built it before him." Daniel nodded slowly, but his eyes were fixed on the dark reflection in their own TV screen. Because for just a second, when the video went black, he could have sworn he saw something standing behind their couch. Daniel checks the house's construction records and discovers the property's original blueprint hides a name that was never meant to be uncovered. Daniel barely slept after the tape ended.
The image of the previous owner whispering into the camera replayed in his mind, but it was the sentence, "It followed me home," that lingered the longest. By morning, he had convinced himself that there had to be a rational explanation. Hidden rooms sometimes existed in older homes. Construction errors happened. People exaggerated when they were under stress. But this house wasn't old. It was completed less than 3 years ago. While Rebecca stayed upstairs, Daniel set up his laptop at the kitchen island and pulled up the county property records. Franklin County kept detailed archives, including permits, construction filings, and original plans submitted by developers. If that basement room existed legally, there would be paperwork. The development company listed on their deed had built several homes in the neighborhood. Daniel found the master subdivision plan easily enough. It showed identical foundations for every property on the street, except theirs. Lot 17 had a minor revision filed during early construction, a foundation modification, according to the note. The amendment included an updated diagram, but the PDF was partially corrupted, leaving only fragments of the blueprint visible. Daniel zoomed in. There, beneath the digital distortion, was an outline that didn't match the final plans they had received before closing. A small, square extension in the basement footprint, 8 by 8 feet.
The room had existed from the beginning. Rebecca walked in just as Daniel found another document attached to the permit file, a contractor request signed by someone whose name didn't appear anywhere else in the development paperwork. Not the builder, not the construction foreman, a private contractor hired separately. The signature read, Elias Brenner. Rebecca frowned. Who's that? Daniel searched the name. The results were sparse. No active business listings, no social media presence, just one archived local news article from 4 years ago. He opened it. The headline described a civil dispute involving a subcontractor who had sued a development company over unpaid custom work. The article mentioned that the contractor, Elias Brenner, had withdrawn the lawsuit months later without explanation. Shortly after, he reportedly moved out of state. There were no follow-up interviews, no additional coverage, just silence. Rebecca leaned against the counter. The previous owner said he found the room. That means he wasn't the one who requested it. Daniel stared at the blueprint again. Something about the dimensions unsettled him. The walls of the hidden room were thicker than standard basement walls, reinforced with additional layers of concrete, almost like they were designed to contain something. He minimized the county site and searched for the first person who had purchased the home after construction was completed.
The name that appeared on the original deed made Daniel's pulse spike. The first buyer was not the man from the tape. It was someone else entirely. And that individual had only owned the house for 11 days before transferring the property under unusual circumstances. Rebecca noticed the change in Daniel's expression. "What is it?" He turned the screen toward her. The original buyer's name was listed as deceased, cause of death undetermined. Daniel and Rebecca uncover what happened during those 11 days and why the house was quietly resold without ever being listed publicly. The name of the original buyer sat on the screen like a stain that wouldn't wipe away. Thomas Whitaker, age 39, purchased the property upon completion, deceased 11 days later, cause of death listed as undetermined pending investigation. Rebecca felt an uncomfortable chill settle in her chest. Undetermined doesn't mean natural. Daniel nodded, already opening another tab. He searched local news archives, scrolling through articles from the year the house had been built. At first, nothing surfaced beyond routine suburban headlines, school board meetings, minor traffic accidents, seasonal festivals. Then he found a brief report buried on page 6 of a regional paper. The headline was understated. Man found dead in newly constructed home. The article explained that emergency responders were called to the residence after a neighbor reported hearing what sounded like repeated banging late at night. When officers arrived, they discovered Whitaker unresponsive in the basement. No signs of forced entry, no visible injuries. The medical examiner cited unexplained internal trauma, but could not determine a precise cause. Rebecca read over his shoulder. Internal trauma from what? The article offered no answers. It mentioned that the case was closed after no evidence of foul play was discovered. The home was transferred back to the development company through a legal process that wasn't elaborated on.
Daniel scrolled further and found a short follow-up published weeks later. It stated that the property had been resold to a private buyer who requested anonymity at the time of purchase. "That must be the man from the tape," Rebecca whispered. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking. If Whitaker died in the basement, then he must have known about the room. Rebecca hesitated. Or something down there found him. The idea hung in the air longer than either of them liked. Daniel pulled up satellite images of the neighborhood from the year construction began. He zoomed out slowly, studying the surrounding land. Before the development existed, the area had been mostly wooded with a narrow access road running along the edge of the property line. Rebecca noticed something odd in one of the older images. "What's that clearing?" Daniel magnified the area just beyond where their backyard now stood. There had once been a small structure there, rectangular, separate from the subdivision plans, and present months before any houses were built. In later images, it disappeared entirely, replaced by leveled earth. He searched again, this time using historical property maps. The land had previously belonged to a private owner whose records were sealed due to litigation decades ago. The name connected back to an old family trust. The trust shared a surname with the subcontractor who built the basement enclosure, Brenner. Rebecca stepped away from the counter, unsettled. So the contractor wasn't random. He had ties to whoever owned this land before the development. Daniel nodded slowly, which means that room wasn't an afterthought. The furnace kicked on downstairs, and both of them flinched at the sudden vibration beneath their feet. Rebecca glanced toward the basement door. What if Whitaker didn't die because of something medical? Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reopened the VHS footage and paused on the frame where the previous owner had looked toward the corner. In the background, just barely visible against the concrete, was something Whitaker would have seen too. The outline in the corner had height, form. And now that Daniel was looking closely, he realized something far worse. The shadow on the tape was cast in the wrong direction. Daniel measures the light source in the basement and discovers that whatever stood in that corner did not obey the laws of physics. Daniel replayed the VHS footage 3 times before he trusted what he was seeing. He paused on the clearest frame, the one where the previous owner sat rigid in the bolted chair, his face turned slightly toward the corner. The single overhead bulb in the basement cast a harsh beam from above and slightly to the left of the camera. Every object in the frame reflected that position. The chair legs angled their shadows toward the back wall, and the man's head created a faint outline stretching diagonally across the concrete. Except for the figure in the corner. Its shadow fell forward, toward the light. Rebecca stood behind Daniel as he sketched a rough diagram on a legal pad. He marked the position of the camera, the bulb, the chair, and the visible walls. The angles didn't align with what appeared in the footage. Even if someone had been standing there physically, their silhouette would have been thrown in the opposite direction. "It's either an optical illusion," Daniel said carefully, "or something that wasn't interacting with the room the way it should." Rebecca folded her arms tightly. "You're saying it wasn't casting a shadow?" Daniel shook his head.
I'm saying the shadow wasn't caused by the light. The distinction unsettled both of them. They went back downstairs together, this time bringing a portable work lamp from the garage. Daniel positioned it roughly where the bulb had hung in the video. The hidden room felt colder than before, though the thermostat upstairs read normal. He stepped inside cautiously and aimed the work lamp toward the center of the room. The metal chair gleamed under the brightness. Every angle behaved predictably. The bolts cast sharp lines. Rebecca stood near the back wall and watched her own shadow stretch cleanly along the concrete.
"Move toward the corner," Daniel instructed. She did, hesitating as she approached the exact spot where the dark figure had appeared in the recording. The beam illuminated the wall behind her. Nothing unusual happened. Daniel adjusted the angle of the lamp. He shifted it higher, then lower, replicating every position he could think of from the footage. Still, every shadow responded logically. Rebecca exhaled slowly. Maybe it was just distortion from the tape. Daniel wanted to accept that explanation, but something nagged at him. He reviewed the paused frame on his phone while standing inside the room. Then he looked at the concrete surface directly behind Rebecca. The texture didn't match. In the video, the section where the shadow appeared looked darker than the surrounding wall even before the figure shifted, almost like a stain embedded deep within the material. Daniel stepped closer to the corner and ran his hand across the concrete. It was colder there, significantly colder. Rebecca noticed his expression change. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the wall and held it there. The temperature difference wasn't subtle. It felt as though something behind the concrete absorbed warmth from the surface. Then Rebecca saw it. A faint outline emerged along the wall where Daniel's hand had been resting. Not moisture, not condensation. A thin, darker imprint forming slowly against the concrete, and it was taller than Daniel. They both stepped back at the same time as the outline lengthened upward without any visible source. The work lamp flickered once, then steadied. The outline remained.
The temperature shift was no longer subtle. Within minutes of the outline forming on the concrete, Daniel could see his breath. Rebecca instinctively rubbed her arms, though the rest of the basement remained at a normal temperature. The cold was isolated to the hidden room, concentrated along the wall where the dark imprint had appeared. Daniel stepped forward again, despite every instinct telling him not to. He pressed the back of his hand lightly against the concrete. It felt like touching metal left outside during a Midwestern winter. Rebecca checked her phone. "The thermostat upstairs says 72. Daniel nodded, which means this isn't connected to the HVAC. The work lamp flickered once more, then stabilized, casting a bright white glare across the walls. Under that light, the dark outline became clearer. It wasn't just a vague stain anymore. Its edges had definition, the suggestion of shoulders, a narrowing at what would be a waist, and a faint elongation where a head might be. Rebecca's voice trembled despite her effort to stay calm. "It looks like it's facing us." Daniel swallowed. The shape was oriented toward the center of the room, not angled sideways like a trick of perspective. It felt intentional. Then came the sound, a low rhythmic thud from behind the wall. Not random, measured, as if something heavy pressed against the concrete from the other side and then released. Rebecca stepped back toward the doorway. "There isn't anything behind that wall. It's the foundation." Daniel knew she was right. According to the blueprints, the hidden room was surrounded by reinforced concrete on all sides. Beyond that would be packed earth, solid ground. The thud came again, slightly stronger. A faint vibration traveled through the floor and into the metal chair. The bolts emitted a thin metallic hum as they absorbed the movement. Daniel forced himself to think rationally.
Ground shifting, maybe. Soil expansion. Rebecca shook her head. Soil doesn't knock. The outline on the wall darkened as if absorbing the shadow from the room itself. The air felt denser, heavier with every passing second. Daniel noticed frost beginning to form along the lower edge of the concrete, creeping outward in delicate crystalline patterns. Then the pressure changed. Instead of a single thud, there was a sustained push. The wall didn't crack, but it bowed ever so slightly inward, subtle enough that someone might miss it unless they were staring directly at it. Daniel was staring directly at it. Rebecca gasped, "That's not possible." The metal chair scraped faintly against its bolts, not because it moved, but because something in the floor shifted beneath it. Daniel realized the vibration wasn't just coming from the wall, it was beneath them. The frost spread faster now, climbing upward around the dark outline as though tracing its edges. The shape seemed almost three-dimensional, no longer flat against the surface. Then, without warning, 5 distinct impressions appeared in the concrete, directly at chest height, finger-shaped, pressing cutward. Rebecca grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him toward the doorway. "We need to leave." But Daniel couldn't stop looking at the handprints forming from the inside, because the fingers were too long, and there were 6 of them. The pressure intensified for a final second, and then everything went still. The frost stopped spreading. The wall returned to its rigid position, but the handprints remained, embedded faintly beneath the surface. The work lamp dimmed again, though the power never fully cut. Rebecca whispered, "It's trying to get through." Daniel nodded slowly, and deep in the foundation beneath their feet, something shifted as if repositioning itself.
Daniel discovers what lies beneath the hidden room's foundation and why the reinforced concrete was never meant to keep something out, but to trap it inside. Daniel didn't speak until they were back upstairs with the basement door locked behind them. Rebecca paced the kitchen, glancing repeatedly toward the floor, as if expecting the tiles to crack open. The house felt structurally intact, but something had changed in the air. It wasn't just fear, it was awareness, like the building itself had shifted from passive shelter to silent observer. "We need to know what's under that room," Daniel said finally. Rebecca stopped pacing. "You saw the blueprints, its foundation and soil." "That's what the approved plan says, but the revised document showed reinforcement, extra thickness. That's not standard unless you're containing pressure." Rebecca stared at him. "Containing pressure from what?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a flashlight and headed back downstairs, this time stopping before the hidden room. He studied the outer basement wall adjacent to it, tracing where the concrete lines met. If the room had thicker reinforcement, the difference would be visible from the exterior side. He ran his hand along the surface and noticed a slight ridge, subtle but distinct. The wall was layered, 2 separate pours of concrete bonded together. Rebecca joined him, keeping her distance from the hidden doorway. "That's not typical construction, is it?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "It's overbuilt." He stepped back and looked at the floor instead. If something had pressed from below earlier, there had to be an access point during construction. Concrete foundations are poured over prepared ground. Before that, there's excavation. Daniel retrieved a small rubber mallet from his toolbox and tapped gently along the basement floor outside the hidden room. The sound was solid at first, dense and consistent. Then, near the corner closest to the back wall, the tone shifted slightly, hollow, faint but noticeably different. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. That doesn't sound right. Daniel knelt and tapped again in a tight grid pattern. The hollow echo formed a small rectangular area about 3 feet wide. He stood slowly.
There's a void beneath this section. Rebecca swallowed. You think there's another room?
Or something left behind when they poured the slab. Daniel remembered the old satellite image showing a structure on the land before development began. If something had been there before the subdivision, it might not have been completely removed. It could have been sealed over. He searched online for excavation permits filed before construction. The developer had cleared the lot legally, but there was no record of a full subterranean demolition, only surface grading and foundation work. Rebecca stepped closer to him, her voice lowered. What if they built the hidden room over something they didn't want uncovered? Daniel looked toward the sealed door, or around it. The implications settled heavily between them. If the reinforced room was constructed not to keep something out, but to contain something already present beneath the property, then the pressure they felt earlier hadn't come from outside the foundation walls. It had come from below. A faint vibration passed through the floor again, subtle but undeniable. Not violent, not chaotic, measured, intentional. Daniel stared at the hollow section of concrete beneath his feet, realizing that whatever pressed against the hidden wall earlier might not be trying to break into the house. It might be trying to break upward. Rebecca's voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. What do we do? Daniel exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. We find out what they buried. Because if something had been sealed beneath reinforced concrete, hidden under layers of official paperwork and silence, then the room in the basement wasn't the origin point. It was the lid. And lids only exist for one reason. Daniel stood over the hollow section of concrete for nearly a full minute before deciding he was past the point of pretending none of this was real. Rebecca watched him retrieve a heavy-duty masonry drill from the garage, her silence no longer rooted in doubt, but in the quiet acceptance that they were already too involved to walk away. If this compromises the foundation, she began.
It won't, Daniel replied, though his certainty felt manufactured. I'm not tearing out a support beam. I just need to know what's under here. He marked a small square near the center of the hollow echo and began drilling. The sound of metal biting into concrete echoed through the basement, sharp and aggressive. Dust filled the air as he worked methodically, carving out a manageable section rather than attacking the entire slab at once. The first crack came faster than expected. A hairline fracture split across the surface, and Daniel widened it carefully until a chunk of concrete loosened enough to pry upward. When he lifted the piece away, a cold draft rose immediately from the opening. Rebecca stepped closer, holding the flashlight steady. Below the slab wasn't packed earth. It was empty space. Daniel widened the opening enough to peer down. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a drop of roughly 5 feet before hitting solid ground. The floor below wasn't soil, it was stone, older, uneven, and worn smooth in places, as if something had moved across it repeatedly over time. Rebecca's voice barely rose above a whisper. That's not part of the foundation. Daniel shook his head slowly. The walls of the void beneath the slab were lined with stone blocks that didn't match modern construction materials. They were arranged deliberately, mortared with an older technique that looked almost historical. It predates the house, he said quietly. He widened the hole enough to fit through and lowered himself carefully into the chamber below. The air was significantly colder than the basement, dry but dense. Rebecca followed after a hesitant pause. The space beneath was larger than either of them expected, stretching beyond the edges of the hidden room above. It felt ancient compared to the fresh framing upstairs. The stone walls curved slightly inward near the ceiling, creating a chamber-like enclosure rather than a simple crawl space. In the center of the floor sat something that made Rebecca stop moving entirely. A circular metal ring embedded into the stone. Attached to it were remnants of heavy chains.
Rust had eaten through portions of the links, but several pieces remained intact.
The ring itself was bolted deep into the stone, far older than the modern chair above. Daniel scanned the walls with the flashlight. Faint markings etched into the stone formed irregular symbols. They weren't decorative. They looked deliberate, carved with effort rather than artistry. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. The chair upstairs? It was positioned directly over this. Daniel nodded. Whatever was restrained down here was later contained up there. A soft vibration passed through the stone beneath their feet, more distinct now that they stood directly above its source. Dust shifted along the floor in a thin ripple. Rebecca's breathing grew shallow. It's still here. Daniel angled the flashlight toward the far end of the chamber. At first, he saw only darkness. Then he noticed something darker within it. A vertical shape pressed against the far wall, almost blending into the stone. It wasn't carved. It wasn't a shadow. It was deep, like an opening in the rock itself. And as they stared at it, the opening seemed to expand slightly, as though reacting to their presence. The vibration intensified, steady and rhythmic. Rebecca grabbed Daniel's arm. "That's not a crack in the wall." Daniel felt the temperature drop further, and the faint outline of something began to shift within the opening. The reinforced room above suddenly made sense. It wasn't built to contain something inside the house. It was built to keep something from rising out of this chamber. And now they had removed part of the seal. The opening in the stone widens, and Daniel hears a voice that does not come from the basement, but from beneath the earth itself. Daniel kept the flashlight fixed on the dark vertical opening, trying to convince himself it was a trick of light and shadow. The beam trembled slightly in his grip, though he told
himself that it was only from the cold. The stone walls of the chamber seemed to absorb sound, muting even the faint scrape of their shoes against the floor. Then, the vibration beneath them shifted into something more defined. It wasn't just movement anymore. It was rhythm. Rebecca felt it through the soles of her feet first, a steady pulsing that traveled up through her legs. She gripped Daniel's arm tighter. "Do you hear that?" At first, he thought it was the echo of his own heartbeat. But as he focused, he realized the rhythm was too slow, too deliberate. It carried a subtle resonance, like air being forced through a narrow passage deep underground. The dark opening in the far wall expanded another inch, not with a violent crack, but with gradual displacement, as though the stone itself were softening around its edges. The temperature dropped sharply, and Daniel's breath fogged thick in front of him. Then came the sound. A whisper. Low, strained, almost indistinguishable from the vibration. Rebecca's eyes widened. That's not the house. Daniel listened carefully. The whisper didn't echo in the chamber the way their voices did. It seemed to originate from within the opening itself, traveling outward rather than bouncing off stone. He stepped closer despite the warning screaming in his mind. The flashlight beam entered the darkness but failed to illuminate its depth. It was not simply a crack or a hollow void. It felt like a space that extended beyond the physical structure of the chamber. The whisper sharpened into something clearer. A single word at first. Cold. Rebecca flinched. It said something. Daniel nodded slowly. The voice didn't sound monstrous or distorted. It sounded strained, almost human, but stretched thin, as though filtered through layers of earth. Another word followed. Alone. The air seemed to compress around them. Rebecca's breathing quickened. It's trying to talk to us.
Daniel felt a sudden wave of conflicting thoughts. If something had been sealed here decades ago, reinforced by concrete and steel above, then someone had known about this chamber.
Someone had decided it needed to stay buried. The whisper grew stronger, forming a fractured sentence. "Let me up." Rebecca stepped back instinctively. "No." The stone floor trembled lightly as if responding to the plea. Dust trickled from the ceiling where Daniel had broken through the slab above. He forced himself to analyze the tone rather than the words. The voice carried no clear threat. It sounded desperate, but desperation could be deceptive. "Why were there chains?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely steady. "Why reinforce it unless it was dangerous?" The opening in the wall pulsed faintly, widening just enough for a darker shape to move within it. Daniel couldn't make out features, only depth shifting against depth. The whisper changed, not pleading now, aware. "You opened it." Rebecca felt the shift instantly. The temperature plummeted another degree and the vibration intensified into a deeper resonance that rattled faintly through the stone. Daniel understood something then that made his stomach drop. This wasn't random. It hadn't awakened when they discovered the hidden room. It had responded when they broke the seal. And now it knew they were there. The voice came again, clearer than before. "I can see you." Rebecca grabbed Daniel's arm with sudden urgency. "We need to get out, right now." Because whatever was beneath the earth no longer sounded trapped. It sounded patient. The sealed chamber begins to collapse upward, and Daniel realizes the voice below already knows his name.
Rebecca didn't wait for Daniel to respond. She pulled him toward the opening in the ceiling where the basement floor had been broken, her movements urgent but controlled. The chamber beneath the slab felt unstable now, as if the air itself had weight. Dust drifted from the stone ceiling in fine, steady streams. Behind them, the dark opening in the far wall pulsed again. Not wider, closer. Daniel felt it before he saw it. The space between them and the wall seemed shorter than it had seconds earlier, as though distance had become unreliable. He forced himself not to look back, but when a low vibration rolled across the stone floor, instinct overpowered restraint. The darkness within the opening had changed shape. It no longer resembled a vertical crack. It resembled a doorway, and something stood within it. Not fully visible, not defined, but present in a way that made the air tighten around his lungs. "Go," Rebecca whispered sharply. Daniel boosted her up through the hole in the slab first. She scrambled onto the basement floor above, then turned to reach for him. As he grabbed her arm and pulled himself upward, the chamber below emitted a sound that was unmistakably different from the earlier whispers. It was not a plea. It was recognition. "Daniel!" The voice was clearer now, no longer strained by distance. Daniel froze halfway through the opening. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Don't respond!" He hadn't planned to, but the fact that it knew his name fractured something in his reasoning. They had never spoken down there. They had not introduced themselves. No identifying details had been shared. Yet the voice had spoken with quiet certainty.
He hauled himself fully onto the basement floor, and together they stared at the hole in the concrete. The chamber beneath remained visible, but the dark doorway at the far wall was no longer directly in view from this angle. The basement lights flickered. Rebecca moved toward the hidden room instinctively, as if proximity to it somehow made more sense than standing over the broken slab. Daniel grabbed a heavy metal shelving unit from the wall and dragged it across the concrete, positioning it over the opening as a temporary barrier. The moment the shelving scraped into place, the vibration intensified. Not violent, measured, testing. The furnace upstairs shut off abruptly, leaving the house in complete silence. Then the voice came again, not from below this time, from behind them. They turned slowly toward the hidden room door. It remained closed, but a thin line of frost had begun to form along its edges, creeping outward into the basement air. "Daniel?" the voice repeated softly. Rebecca's breathing became shallow. "It's not down there anymore." He felt it too. The pressure in the house had shifted location. The reinforced chamber beneath the slab had been one containment point, but the hidden room above had been another, and they had disturbed both. A faint scraping sound echoed from inside the sealed room, the same metallic drag they had heard before. The bolts on the chair rattled faintly, even though no one was inside. Daniel stepped back slowly. It followed the opening. Rebecca shook her head. No, it followed us. The frost line thickened across the basement wall, spreading in branching patterns like veins under the surface. The temperature dropped fast enough that Daniel could see condensation forming along the metal shelving behind him. The voice lowered to a near whisper again. "You opened it." The hidden room door handle shifted slightly, not turning, testing.
Rebecca grabbed Daniel's hand. "We're not staying here." As they backed toward the basement stairs, the door to the reinforced room vibrated faintly against its frame. And just before they reached the first step, the voice spoke one final sentence, calm and assured. "You can't close what you've already let in." The presence moves beyond the basement, and Daniel realizes the hidden room was never the only place it could exist. They didn't stop moving until they were in the kitchen, the basement door shut and locked behind them. Rebecca leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breathing, while Daniel stood in the center of the room listening to the silence. The house no longer felt like a structure made of wood and drywall. It felt layered, as though something unseen occupied the same space, overlapping it. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the overhead light above the kitchen island dimmed slightly. Not enough to go dark, just enough to suggest interference. Rebecca noticed first. "Tell me that's wiring." Daniel wanted to. He walked to the breaker panel in the hallway and opened it. Every switch remained in place, no tripped circuits, no visible fluctuation. Behind him, a faint creak echoed from the second floor. Both of them froze. It wasn't the ordinary settling sound of a new home adjusting to temperature. It was measured, a slow shift of weight across hardwood. Rebecca swallowed. "We're the only ones here." Another step followed. Upstairs. Daniel moved toward the staircase carefully, every instinct telling him not to turn his back on the rest of the house. The air grew colder with each step upward, subtle but undeniable. He reached the landing and looked down the hallway toward their bedroom.
The door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. He was certain it had been closed. Rebecca came up behind him, gripping the banister tightly. "Daniel?" A faint scraping sound came from inside the bedroom. Not violent, not frantic, slow and deliberate, like metal brushing across wood. The same sound from the hidden room. Daniel approached the door cautiously and pushed it open. The room looked untouched at first glance. The bed remained made, the curtains still drawn, but the temperature inside was noticeably lower than the rest of the house. The air felt heavier, pressing gently against his chest. Then he saw it. On the far wall, opposite the bed, a faint dark outline had formed against the paint. Not a shadow cast by furniture, an imprint, taller than either of them. Rebecca stepped into the doorway and felt her pulse spike. It followed us. The imprint shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if adjusting its stance. Daniel felt the same wrongness he had seen on the VHS tape. The direction of light from the bedside lamp didn't align with the shape's orientation. It absorbed brightness instead of reflecting it. A whisper moved through the room, soft but unmistakable. "You left the door open." Rebecca shook her head. "We sealed it."
Daniel's voice was steady, but barely. Not completely. The shelving unit downstairs had only covered the opening temporarily. The hidden room door had never been reinforced beyond a deadbolt. Whatever barrier once existed between the chamber and the house had been broken the moment Daniel cracked the slab. The imprint on the wall deepened, stretching slightly toward the ceiling. Daniel felt a sudden realization settle in. The reinforced room wasn't meant to contain something physically. It was meant to anchor it to a single location. And now that anchor had been disturbed. The whisper moved closer, no longer confined to one corner of the bedroom.
"You can't send me back." Rebecca backed toward the hallway. "We need help." Daniel nodded slowly. This was beyond logic, beyond engineering, beyond county records and blueprints. Whatever had been sealed beneath their home wasn't bound by ordinary structure. And if it could shift from stone to concrete to drywall so easily, then it wasn't limited to walls at all. The bedroom door swung shut on its own, not violently, but with quiet certainty. The lock clicked. Rebecca gasped. The imprint on the wall began to pull away from the surface, separating from the paint like smoke lifting from a flame. The presence fully steps into the room, and Daniel learns why the previous owner bolted the chair to the floor. The bedroom door had locked with a quiet, deliberate click, the kind that sounded mechanical rather than violent. Daniel crossed the room immediately and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Rebecca stood near the hallway wall, unable to look away from the dark shape slowly separating itself from the paint. It wasn't emerging in a dramatic way. There was no tearing sound, no explosive movement. The imprint simply thickened, gained depth, and then peeled forward as if gravity no longer applied to it the same way it did to everything else. The air temperature plummeted again, but this time it wasn't localized to one corner. The cold moved with the shape, following its edges as it detached from the wall. Daniel felt pressure in his ears, like descending too quickly in an airplane. The form remained indistinct, tall and narrow, its edges shifting subtly as though not fully solid. Yet its presence was undeniable. It occupied space. It displaced air. Rebecca found her voice first. "What do you want?" The shape did not answer immediately. Instead, it turned, or gave the impression of turning, toward Daniel. And he understood something in that moment that made his stomach tighten. The reinforced room, the bolted chair, the chains beneath the slab. None of it had been random containment. It had been anchored. "You couldn't hold me there," the voice said, clearer now that it was no longer filtered through stone. "But you could sit with me." Daniel's breath slowed despite the fear. That's why the chair was secured. The presence drifted closer, not walking, but shifting through the space with unnatural ease. He thought if he stayed long enough, I would leave with him. Rebecca's mind raced back to the VHS tape. The previous owner had been seated in that chair willingly, talking, waiting. "It followed me home," he had said. Daniel realized the implication. The chair wasn't meant to restrain the presence. It was meant to restrain the person, to keep them from running, to force proximity. "You attach yourself," Daniel said quietly, piecing it together aloud. "You anchor to whoever stays with you long enough." The room seemed to tighten at that statement, as if acknowledging its accuracy. "He understood," the voice replied, "but not soon enough." Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears. Whitaker died in the basement. Yes. The word carried no emotion. Daniel felt a growing certainty that the presence did not kill violently. It is attached. It lingered. It followed.
The cold intensified as the shape drifted closer to him specifically, bypassing Rebecca as though she were secondary. Daniel felt the air press against his chest, heavy and intimate. "You opened the seal," it said softly. "Now you will sit." The implication was clear. The bolted chair had been a ritualized method of containment. Someone had discovered that remaining stationary within the reinforced room limited the spread. It anchored the presence to a defined space, so long as a living host stayed within it. Rebecca shook her head fiercely. "No, we're not going back down there." The shape paused. For the first time, Daniel sensed resistance.
The presence was strong inside the house, but it still obeyed certain boundaries. It hadn't crossed through exterior walls. It hadn't moved beyond the property line. It needed structure. It needed proximity. It needed a host. Daniel swallowed hard as the realization settled in. The room had not been built to trap the presence alone. It had been built to trap whoever carried it. And now it had chosen him. The voice lowered to a near whisper beside his ear. "You will sit." Daniel makes a decision that could save Rebecca, but it requires stepping back into the reinforced room alone. Daniel understood something with terrifying clarity. The presence wasn't interested in chaos. It wasn't tearing the house apart or attacking blindly. It was narrowing its focus, closing distance with patience that felt older than the foundation beneath them, and it had centered on him. Rebecca reached for his hand, but he gently pulled away. "If it needs proximity," he said carefully, keeping his voice steady, "then distance might still matter." Her eyes filled instantly. "Don't." He forced himself to think logically, even as the air around him felt charged and heavy. The previous owner had bolted the chair down for a reason. He hadn't tried to destroy the room. He hadn't demolished the house. He had contained the presence by remaining in a fixed location long enough to prevent it from spreading further. It attaches, not randomly. It chooses one person. The shape shifted closer, the temperature dropping with it. Rebecca could see condensation gathering faintly along Daniel's shoulders, as if the cold were concentrating around him alone. "You opened it," the voice whispered again, softer now, less forceful. "You will sit." Rebecca stepped in front of Daniel instinctively. "Take me instead." The shape did not respond to her. That silence was answered enough.
Daniel felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he resisted, it might push further into the house, into Rebecca, into whatever boundaries still existed. If he complied, it would anchor itself to him alone. "Whitaker died," Rebecca said through a shaking breath. "The man on the tape left. Maybe there's another way." Daniel thought about that. The previous owner had not died in the basement. He had moved, sold the house, tried to escape. "It followed him," Daniel said quietly. "That's what he meant." Rebecca's voice broke. "Then why stay?" "Because running would spread it. Because the reinforced room limited it. Because the land itself seemed to hold it within defined edges." Daniel felt an unsettling certainty settle in his chest. The presence did not appear capable of crossing the property boundary unless attached to someone who left. The reinforced room was not only containment, it was a tether. If he remained inside it willingly, it might not need to attach permanently. Rebecca grabbed his face in her hands. "We'll call someone, police, a priest, anyone." Daniel gave her a faint, sad smile. "You saw what it is. This isn't something you arrest." The bedroom door unlocked behind them with a soft click, not violently, invitingly. The cold in the room receded slightly, but the pressure around Daniel remained.
"You will sit," the presence repeated, no longer threatening, expectant. Daniel stepped backward toward the hallway. "If I go down there and close the door, you don't follow her." The air tightened briefly, then eased. Agreement. Rebecca shook her head, tears forming now. "You can't do this." "I already did, the moment I broke the seal." He stepped into the hallway, the temperature stabilizing slightly as he moved. The presence followed, gliding just behind him, close but not touching.
Rebecca trailed them, unable to stop him. At the top of the basement stairs, Daniel turned once more. "If it works, it stays with me down there. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence, because he didn't need to. He descended slowly, each step heavier than the last, the air growing colder again as he approached the hidden room. The door stood slightly ajar now, waiting. Daniel sits in the bolted chair and discovers the presence was never alone in the chamber. The basement felt unnaturally still as Daniel stepped off the final stair. Rebecca remained at the top landing, unable to force herself any farther, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hidden room door stood open now, no longer resisting, as though it had been waiting for him to return. The air inside was colder than it had ever been. Daniel entered without speaking. The metal chair sat exactly where it always had, bolted into the concrete, its scratched armrests catching the faint light from the basement bulb. Frost lined the lower edges of the walls, spreading upward in thin crystalline veins. The presence hovered just behind him, close enough that he could feel the weight of it against his spine. "You understand," it murmured. Daniel didn't respond. He stepped toward the chair slowly, studying it with new awareness. The scratches on the armrests were not random panic marks. They were deliberate patterns, carved over time. Someone had remained seated long enough to leave repeated impressions. The previous owner hadn't been restrained. He had restrained himself. Daniel lowered into the chair carefully. The metal felt painfully cold through his clothes. When his hands wrapped around the armrests, he felt a faint vibration beneath the surface of the steel, as if the chair itself carried memory.
Rebecca's voice trembled from the stairwell.
"Daniel, please!"
The moment his full weight settled into the seat, the room shifted. The pressure in the air intensified, condensing around him. The presence moved in front of him now, no longer at his back. It stood inches away, its shape more defined within the reinforced walls than it had been upstairs. "You will hold it," the voice said, softly. Daniel frowned slightly. Hold what? The temperature dropped again, but not from behind him this time, from the far corner of the room. A second darkness began to form along the concrete wall opposite the chair. It was smaller, lower to the ground, and unlike the first presence, this one trembled. Rebecca felt it too from the stairwell, a subtle shift in pressure that felt different from before, not patient, not controlled, uneven. Daniel's pulse quickened as he realized something far worse than he had imagined. The reinforced room had not been built to contain a single entity. It had been built to separate two. The larger presence in front of him did not turn toward the forming shadow in the corner. It remained focused on Daniel. "You broke the seal," it said evenly. "Now it rises." The smaller darkness along the wall thickened, stretching upward erratically, its edges unstable. The air felt charged, almost electric. Daniel understood with chilling clarity. The first presence was not the prisoner. It was the guard. The chains beneath the slab had not been meant for it. They had been meant for what was coming through now. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "There's something else in there." The larger presence leaned closer to Daniel, its outline sharpening slightly within the cold air. "You will anchor me," it said calmly, "or it will anchor to her." Daniel felt the full weight of the choice pressing against him.
The smaller shadow in the corner pulsed violently once, and a deep crack split faintly along the concrete wall behind it. The reinforced room had never been about keeping something in. It had been about keeping something out. And Daniel was now sitting between them. Daniel must decide which presence to bind himself to, and only one of them intends to leave the house alive. Daniel sat in the bolted chair, his hands gripping the frozen steel, while the two presences occupied the reinforced room like opposing poles of the same force. The larger figure stood directly in front of him, steady and controlled, its shape almost stable within the cold air. Behind it, in the far corner, the second presence continued to gather strength, expanding unevenly against the concrete as fractures spidered faintly along the wall. Rebecca remained at the threshold now, tears streaking her face, but unwilling to abandon him. She could feel the tension in the room shifting, like a scale waiting to tip. "You will anchor me," the larger presence repeated, not with menace, but with certainty. "You will anchor me, or it will rise without restraint." Daniel understood what that meant. The first presence had been bound to the chamber for decades, possibly longer, acting as a barrier between the buried force beneath the earth and the structure of the house above. It was not benevolent, but it was controlled. It required proximity, a living tether to stabilize it. The second presence was not controlled. It trembled violently now, its outline jagged and unstable, pressing harder against the cracking concrete. A deep rumble vibrated through the floor beneath Daniel's feet. Rebecca's voice broke. "Don't trust it!" Daniel didn't trust either of them, but he could feel the difference. The force in front of him carried awareness. The one behind it carried hunger. "If I stay," Daniel said quietly, "you don't attach to her. You don't leave this room." The larger presence tilted slightly, as though considering the terms. "I remain anchored, so long as you remain." The second presence surged suddenly, and a loud crack split across the wall. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The temperature plummeted another degree. Daniel made his choice.
He tightened his grip on the armrests and leaned back into the chair, grounding himself. "Then I'm not leaving." The room reacted instantly. The larger presence moved forward and settled around him, not entering his body, but aligning with him, its shape compressing within the boundaries of the reinforced walls. The vibration beneath the floor stabilized, forming a steady hum rather than chaotic tremors. In the corner, the second presence lashed once more against the concrete, but the cracks stopped spreading. The reinforced walls held. Rebecca cried out his name, but Daniel shook his head gently. "You have to go upstairs," he told her, "and you have to seal the slab again." Tears streamed down her face as she backed towards the stairs. "I'm not leaving you." "You're not," he replied softly. "You're keeping it here." The larger presence whispered one final sentence close to his ear. "You understand now." The cold stabilized, no longer spreading beyond the room. The frost stopped at the doorway threshold. Rebecca watched from the stairs as Daniel sat perfectly still in the bolted chair, the air around him unnaturally dense but contained. The house grew quiet again. Days later, contractors would report that the basement slab had been resealed. The hidden room door would remain locked permanently, and Rebecca would tell no one what truly lay beneath the house. But some nights, when the furnace shuts off and the air grows still, she stands at the top of the basement stairs and listens, because sometimes, through the reinforced door, she hears Daniel breathing, and sometimes
She hears something else breathing with him. Some foundations aren't built to hold up a house. They're built to hold something down. If you want more dark stories like this from Canon of Darkness, make sure you subscribe, because the next door we open might not stay closed.